She was promised to a prince feared more for his silence than his sword. On her wedding night, beneath embroidered canopies and centuries of secrets, he leaned in close and whispered the name of another woman. In a palace where loyalty is currency and truth is buried beneath marble floors, Soraya must fight to reclaim a name that was never hers and uncover the one that was stolen. What happens when a shadow refuses to fade? When a heart once silenced begins to speak? Welcome to a tale of forbidden truths, fragile desire, and a love born in the ruins of betrayal. Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And do you believe every historical romance holds a secret waiting to be uncovered? The Bosphorus shimmered like molten silver beneath the waning sun as the palace gates opened to receive her. Soraya Hanım, daughter of a forgotten governor from the Anatolian heartlands, stepped down from the carriage with the poise of a woman who had spent her entire life preparing to be invisible. Her crimson bindorla clung to her form with solemn majesty, its gold-threaded embroidery catching the last embers of the day. Beneath the velvet, she wore an entari of pale cream silk that whispered with every step. A wide, intricately embroidered kushak hugged her waist, and a sheer veil, delicately beaded, draped over her dark braided hair, falling like silence from the pearl-studded headpiece that crowned her. Around her the palace loomed, grand, indifferent, ancient. Its walls did not welcome, they observed. A courtier bowed stiffly. Another gestured forward with gloved hands. No one smiled. She had known this would be so. She was not brought to Istanbul to be loved, admired, or even acknowledged. She was a seal upon a parchment, an offering in silk, a name signed away in exchange for peace between provinces. And now, here she stood, 22 years old, cloaked in crimson and duty. The hallways of Topkapi were lined with quiet servants whose eyes rarely lifted. Oil lamps flickered against the gold-tiled walls, casting shadows like watchful ghosts. The scent of rosewater and polished marble drifted around her, delicate and cold. And in the distance music played, not joyous but ceremonial, measured and distant. Her chamber, though ornate, felt untouched. No flowers, no laughter. Just the soft murmur of silk as Nigar Kalfa, the chief attendant, helped her remove her outer veil. The older woman's fingers were steady, her expression unreadable. "You must not speak unless he asks," Nigar said gently, arranging Soraya's hair beneath the transparent veil. "And if he does not, it means nothing." It meant everything. The hours passed like breath held too long. Night fell behind the lattice screens. Candles were lit. A thin mist of jasmine oil perfumed the air. And finally, the door opened. He did not announce himself. Prince Cemal Efendi entered in silence, dressed in black embroidered kaftan, the silver thread on his collar catching firelight with every movement. His height gave him an air of command, but his gaze, sharp, unreadable, grey as steel, held something far more dangerous than pride: detachment. Soraya remained still, eyes lowered, heart beating far too fast for a woman who had vowed to feel nothing. He did not approach her at first. He moved instead to the window, observing the darkness beyond the glass, as if the night held more meaning than the bride who waited behind him. "You are very young," he said at last. His voice was low, heavy, not unkind, just worn. "I am as I was sent," she replied softly, the only word she dared offer. Silence bloomed between them, thick and uneasy. He turned then, and for the first time his eyes met hers. It was not a lover's gaze, it was not curiosity, it was search. He crossed the chamber slowly, stopping before her, and when he lifted the veil, his hands brushing her cheeks like dusk on marble, Soraya held her breath. He did not smile, he did not speak, until he did. Selin. The name fell from his lips like a memory half buried. Soft, intimate, irrefutable. Soraya did not flinch, but in her chest something shattered quietly. He had not seen her, not really. He had seen a ghost. He turned away before she could speak, not that she would have. He poured himself a glass of sherbet, took one sip, and placed it untouched on the table. "You may rest," he said, and left. The door closed with a whisper. Only then did Soraya let herself breathe. Her hands trembled in her lap. The veil still lay across her shoulders, heavy now with meaning it was never meant to carry. She had been brought to Istanbul as a bride. She had become a shadow, and her name, her real name, had not yet been spoken. Morning in Topkapi arrived not with song or celebration, but with muffled steps and the hushed rustle of veils. The palace, so vast and golden in the eyes of the empire, awakened like a creature that did not sleep, merely paused its breathing. Soraya sat at the edge of the divan in her private chamber, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded with care. Light filtered through the carved wooden lattice of the mashrabia, painting geometric shadows across the silk of her robes. She did not move. She scarcely blinked. Her body remained still, but her thoughts were anything but. The name still echoed in her skull, like a whisper carried by the breeze through the marble corridors. Selin. That name had not belonged to her, and yet it had been spoken over her, into her, as if she had no identity of her own. The prince had not looked at her. He had looked through her and found only memory. But this morning, Soraya refused to carry that wound openly. She allowed Nigar Kalfa to brush her hair in silence, the silver comb catching lightly on the strands. The older woman worked with the reverence of habit, not affection. "You have not eaten," Nigar remarked, her voice cool and matter-of-fact. "I am not hungry." "Still, you must eat. There are eyes everywhere. A bride who weakens quickly is spoken of." Soraya said nothing. She had quickly learned that in Topkapi, words were precious currency. One spent them at great cost. Nigar finished the braid and secured it beneath a simple Yemeni embroidered with subtle gold thread. Soraya's ferace, today in a deep shade of forest green, had been freshly pressed and scented with lavender. The attendant nodded once and stepped back, arms crossed behind her back like a general inspecting a soldier. "You may walk the harem gardens this morning, but do not speak unless spoken to. Do not linger where you are not wanted, and above all," Nigar paused, "do not ask about what was before you." The warning was not cruel. It was carved from something older than fear, something like devotion or sorrow. Soraya offered a quiet nod. She would obey, but inside, questions stirred like leaves beneath still water. The Harem-i Humayun, the imperial harem, was nothing like she had imagined. It was not a place of seduction and laughter, as whispered in the outer provinces. It was a labyrinth, both beautiful and suffocating. High archways opened into long corridors, and long corridors led to chambers where time had grown stale. Every corner was watched, not by guards, but by women. Women who had learned to smile with only their mouths. Women who had been brought in as gifts, prizes, promises, some willing, many not. Some carried perfume and pearls, others bore silence like armor. As Soraya walked past a pair of young odalisks, their eyes followed her. They did not bow, they did not greet her. One of them, barely 16, tilted her head and whispered something to the other in a language Soraya could not place. They laughed softly, not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly. She passed into the garden, where the winter sun warmed the stone pathways only enough to fool the roses into thinking spring might come. Soraya found a bench beneath a thin cypress and sat, letting her fingers trace the embroidery on her sleeve. A sparrow fluttered down to peck at the moss between the tiles. From a distance, she heard the gentle rhythm of water spilling from a marble fountain, the sound soft enough to mask footsteps. "Do you read, Hanum?" asked a voice, thin, breathy, almost afraid. Soraya looked up. A woman, aged beyond her years but not yet old, stood holding a basket of dried flowers. Her hands were stained with saffron and rose powder. "I do," Soraya replied, her voice low. The woman stepped closer. Her eyes, pale brown and quick, darted around before she sat beside her. The gesture was bold, almost improper. "I was once maid to the other one," she said, not looking at Soraya. "Which other one?" "You know which." Soraya said nothing. The woman continued. "She liked poetry, Persian verses mostly. Hafez, Rumi. She used to say that the heart is the only chamber with no locks, that no empire could ever rule what bleeds in silence." A chill ran through Soraya that had nothing to do with the wind. "She vanished," the woman whispered. "That's what they say. But silk does not vanish without being torn." Soraya's fingers curled into the fabric of her gown. "She had a friend," the woman added. "A girl from Konya. They used to sit in the old alcove near the saffron kitchens reading letters. I think she found something she shouldn't have. Then one day, she stopped appearing. The girl, too, gone." "Why are you telling me this?" Soraya asked carefully. "Because you remind me of her. You walk like a woman listening for the footsteps of ghosts." The woman rose suddenly. "Forget I spoke." But before she turned away, she slipped a small sachet into Soraya's palm. "For your sleep. It carries no dreams." Soraya watched her go, the dried petals in her hand suddenly feeling heavier than gold. She did not rise. Not yet. The day faded into shadow long before the sun surrendered. In Topkapi, time moved not by hours, but by the passing of couriers, the toll of the call to prayer, the shifting glances of eunuchs who never blinked. When Soraya returned to her chamber, Nigar was waiting. "You spoke to someone," she said flatly. "Yes." "Who?" "I did not ask her name." "You should have. Not for curiosity, for protection." Soraya stepped inside, placing the sachet gently in a porcelain bowl. "Why are you afraid of the past?" she asked. "I'm not afraid," Nigar replied, folding her arms. "But I have buried too many girls who asked too many questions." A beat of silence stretched between them. "She wasn't the only one, was she?" Soraya asked. "Selin." Nigar's expression changed, only slightly, but it was enough. "There have been many wives, some forgotten by choice, some remembered with pain, some—" her eyes lingered on Soraya, "some remembered by mistake." She extinguished a candle and turned away. "Rest now, Hanum. Tomorrow the court will request your presence for the morning salutation." And with that, Nigar disappeared into the corridor, her slippers brushing against the marble like wind over grave dust. Left alone, Soraya sat once more on the divan. She unpinned her veil and let her hair fall loosely for the first time since her arrival. She touched her cheek where the prince's fingers had lifted the veil the night before. Selin. She did not speak the name aloud, but it pulsed in the air, invisible, undeniable. Soraya closed her eyes. She had been told to remain silent. But silence in Topkapi was a language more dangerous than speech. And someone, somewhere within those walls, was still listening. The palace glowed that evening like an ember preparing to fade into ash, its golden domes catching the last fire of the sun before darkness claimed them. Inside, the divan hall had been transformed into a shimmering tableau of ceremony and control. Lanterns flickered above tapestries embroidered with tulips and crescents, and silks from Bursa flowed like water down the shoulders of the empire's most powerful men. It was the first state dinner Soraya was commanded to attend. She stood in her chamber as Nigar Kalfa secured the last clasp of her bindala, this one of deep sapphire velvet with embroidery so fine it appeared stitched by moonlight itself. Her hair had been coiled into 2 braids, wrapped high and adorned with silver pins in the shape of blooming almond flowers. At her throat hung a single amethyst stone, offered by the palace's jewel keeper with the offhand remark that it once belonged to a consort now buried beneath roses. "Do not speak unless addressed," Nigar murmured behind her, tightening the sash. "Do not laugh, do not drink too much. Above all, do not meet anyone's gaze longer than courtesy demands." Soraya met Nigar's eyes in the mirror. "And if they meet mine, lower yours. You are not here to shine, Hanum, you are here to reflect." It was a brutal instruction, spoken with the kind of love that had been folded into armor. Soraya nodded once. She did not need reminders of her place. The long corridors toward the divan hall were dim, despite the light. Guards stood at attention. Attendants whispered her name to one another, never daring to say it aloud. The scent of roasted lamb, dates, rose water, and strong coffee floated through the marble arches, like a spell meant to distract the senses from the true purpose of the gathering: politics and scrutiny. When she entered, the hum of conversation lessened, not stopped, but shifted, like wind changing direction. She was announced by a eunuch with a ceremonial bow, his voice impersonal. Her presence was noted and then absorbed. She saw him immediately, Prince Semal, at the center of the long table beneath the imperial crest. He wore a dark kaftan of midnight blue with silver edges so sharp they looked like blades. His fez rested beside his elbow, his expression still and sovereign. He did not stand. He did not look away. He merely watched, and so she walked. Her seat, carefully arranged by rank and etiquette, was 2 chairs away from his, between a noblewoman from Izmir whose silk gown whispered every time she moved, and a scholar from Edirne who smelled faintly of ink and cloves. Goblets were filled, platters arrived, toasts were made, and then the games began. The words were soft, expertly crafted, dipped in honeyed voices and sprinkled with smiles. "So you are from Shoreham, are you not?" asked the lady in lilac beside her, raising a painted fan to her lips. "I do love provincial girls. They always look so grateful." "Yes," added a man across the table, his sash glimmering with medals. "So untouched by the sins of court life, though some might say too untouched." Laughter floated like perfume. Soraya smiled, not in mirth, but in poise. "It is true. I bring only what I am," she said calmly, "and leave behind what I am not." There was a pause, then another laugh, lower this time. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward, eyes glinting beneath thick brows. Pasha Mahmud, the man whose whispers moved more ink than armies. "Such modesty is rare," he said, his tone warm but sharpened with something colder. "Though some might argue modesty can be a disguise. I wonder, does modesty make one invisible, or just easier to overlook?" Another silence, another smile. The man beside him chuckled as he bit into a fig. "Perhaps it is easier to overlook what was never meant to remain." The statement hung like incense smoke, impossible to brush away. Selin. They were speaking of her, not by name, but by presence. She was still seated at this table, invisible and eternal. Soraya felt it in the way they looked at her, not as a bride, but as a placeholder, a substitute, a silence. She did not answer. To answer would be to confess vulnerability, and Soraya had none to spare. She reached instead for her goblet, lifting it with unshaking fingers. "I find," she said slowly, "that the court sees only what it chooses to remember, and forgets only what it fears." The words were soft, but they struck. A few heads turned. A younger diplomat dropped his spoon, and at the head of the table, Prince Jamal raised his glass, just once, barely, but enough. Pasha Mahmud tilted his head, amused. "Spoken like a woman who reads," he said. "Only what I am allowed," she replied. His smile did not falter, but the gleam in his eye cooled. The conversation shifted again, toward trade, borders, horses, toward matters Soraya was expected not to understand. She listened, she learned. As dessert arrived, almond pastries wrapped in gold foil and dusted with powdered sugar, she excused herself with the grace of someone who had not forgotten the weight of her station. The palace gardens outside the divan hall were quiet, moonlit, and still. She walked alone, hands clasped before her, the fabric of her gown brushing softly against the cobblestones. She heard the step before he spoke. "You answered well." She turned. Semal stood just beyond the arch, arms crossed behind his back, his expression unreadable. "I did not know I was being tested," she said. "You always are," he replied. "Here, silence is submission, but speech can be interpreted as defiance. Then I will be misunderstood no matter what I do. He looked at her then. Not past her, not through her, at her. Perhaps, he said, it is better to be feared than forgotten. Her breath caught slightly. I do not wish to be either, she said. He took a slow step forward, and then another. Then what do you wish to be, Soraya Hanım? The way he said her name, fully, clearly, without error or hesitation, stilled the air between them. She did not answer. She could not. The truth, she feared, would be too small for this moment. He watched her for a moment longer, then nodded once. Your restraint is not weakness, he said, but it will be tested, often. Then he turned, the folds of his cloak trailing like shadows behind him, and disappeared into the corridor. Soraya stood beneath the carved stone arch, her hand resting lightly against the chilled marble. Above her, the stars shimmered over Istanbul like secrets refusing to be named. She closed her eyes. She had not been chosen to shine. But now, someone had seen her, even if only for a moment. The garden behind the Harem-i Humayun did not boast grandeur. It did not echo with the waters of marble fountains or shimmer with imported orchids. It was smaller, quieter, an inner court surrounded by latticed stone walls and narrow arches. Cypress trees stood like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes pointing skyward as if pleading with the heavens. Roses grew in disciplined rows, pruned into submission, their fragrance heavy as velvet. It was late afternoon when Soraya wandered there, after fulfilling her obligations in the embroidery hall and enduring the curious glances of women who measured her worth with needlework and silence. She had walked with purpose, though she did not know where her feet intended to take her. Here, the stillness felt different. It was not empty, but expectant. A breeze moved through the garden like breath, gentle and searching. The soft scrape of her slippers against stone was the only sound, until another set of footsteps joined hers. She turned before he spoke, though he had made no effort to hide. Prince Jamal stood just inside the garden's northern archway, dressed in a simple chepkan coat of charcoal grey and dark shalva. His hair was wind-brushed, slightly out of place. His hands were clasped behind him. His presence did not startle her. Not anymore. It is rare to find this corner of the palace unoccupied, he said. I do not believe it is truly unoccupied, she answered softly. Only less watched. A pause stretched between them. He looked toward the rose bushes as though they might speak for him. Then his gaze returned to her, not commanding, not demanding, but aware. You are not what I expected, he said. Nor are you. She expected that might end the conversation, but it did not. Jamal moved closer, his steps measured, careful not to disrupt the rhythm of the moment. He stopped just beside a low stone bench and gestured. May I? You outrank me, she said quietly. I asked anyway. She inclined her head once. He sat, and after a breath, so did she, keeping a respectful distance between them. Yet in the quiet air between their shoulders, something flickered. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of cold. Your answers, he said at length, they are precise, but not practiced. It is rare to see a woman who chooses her words as if they were weapons. I do not use them to harm, Soraya replied. No, but you do not waste them either. He glanced at her then, fully. There was no judgment in his gaze, only the trace of something unreadable, as though he were still assembling her face from scattered pieces. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture composed, though she felt the weight of every breath. Do you often come here? He asked. She shook her head. No, I only found it today. His eyes lingered on hers. You will find that this palace does not give its corners freely. It waits to see who deserves them, or who dares to stay, she said. Their eyes locked, and in that silence the breath between them grew heavy. It was not desire, it was not comfort, it was recognition. And then, as if summoned by the sudden closeness, a distant bell rang through the corridor, calling him elsewhere. He rose. She did not. Be careful, Soraya Hanım, he said before turning away. "Some spaces in Topkapi are quiet for a reason." She nodded, though the meaning in his warning was unclear. When he was gone, the silence returned. But it no longer felt expectant. It felt protective. Later that evening, after supper had been taken in silence and the palace retreated into the hush of lamplit halls, Soraya returned to the corridor that bordered the embroidery chamber. A draught had passed through there earlier, and with it a scent, faint but distinct, of saffron and ink. The wall at the end of the corridor held no ornamentation, only a shelf of abandoned ledgers and a curtain faded by time. Something had whispered to her intuition, a thread she could not name. She moved the curtain aside. Behind it, a narrow door, no lock, no handle, only a wooden panel worn smooth with age. She pressed her hand against it. It gave with little resistance. The air inside was dry and laced with the scent of parchment. Dust rose in a thin veil. The room was small, barely a chamber, more a forgotten alcove. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books, scrolls, folded letters sealed in twine. A reading nook sat in the corner. A cushion lay flattened by time. Soraya stepped inside and let the door fall closed behind her. A lantern hung from a hook near the entrance. She lit it with care, shielding the flame. The golden light trembled over the titles on the spines. Most were in Ottoman Turkish, others in Persian and Arabic. Poetry, history, philosophy. Not the readings of servants or slaves. This had belonged to a woman of status, a woman of learning. Her fingers moved over the covers until one drew her attention. A leather-bound volume with no title, its spine frayed, but the binding intact. She opened it. Pressed between the pages was a rose, once red, now faded to a brittle rust. Its petals, though dried, still clung together, as if remembering the hand that had placed them there. And just beneath the bloom, the faintest stain, a smear of brown too dark to be ink. Blood. She inhaled, sharp and shallow. It had not been forgotten. It had been left. There was no inscription, no signature, but something in the way the rose was placed so gently, so deliberately, spoke of love and of finality. She turned the pages, slowly now, reverently. The book contained poems, mostly Hafez, a few verses underlined in fading graphite, one passage circled faintly, as if by a trembling hand. "I have wrapped my soul in silence, but my eyes betray the fire I buried long ago." Soraya closed the book. This room had been Seelin's, or at least Seelin had once stood here, had read here, had left behind this rose with its silent wound. Why? Why would a woman disappear and leave no scream, no letter, no cry, only a dried flower in a forgotten book? Unless she had no chance to leave anything more, unless someone made sure she did not. The lantern flickered, casting her shadow long and uncertain across the far wall. She placed the book back on the shelf, exactly as it had been. And then she slipped back through the door, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the weight of knowing too little and needing more. In her chamber that night, she lay awake beneath the silk canopy, staring at the velvet darkness above her. The prince's voice echoed in her ears, low and solemn. "Be careful, Soraya Hanım." And for the first time, she wondered if he had not been warning her about the palace, but about himself. The morning had arrived veiled in fog, blanketing the courtyards in a muted hush that made the palace feel even more like a mausoleum of secrets. From her window, Soraya watched the mist curl around the slender cypress trees, their silhouettes swaying gently as if whispering to one another things not meant for the living. Nigar Kalfa had laid out a pale blue robe on the divan without a word. "It was ordered to be sent," she explained, smoothing the delicate folds of silk and brushing a hand over the silver embroidery that shimmered like morning frost. "From the imperial wardrobe." Soraya turned, her gaze landing on the garment. It was different from her usual gowns, lighter, more luminous, the kind of blue that belonged to early sky or to dreams half remembered. Silver thread ran along the cuffs and hem, intricate and precise. The robe was elegant, untouched by time, yet as she reached for it, a tremor passed through her fingers. There was something in the fabric, something beyond texture and weight. "Who wore it before?" she asked quietly. Nigar's eyes narrowed just slightly, her lips thinning. "No one you need to think of." But the silence that followed spoke too loudly. "Selin." Soraya said nothing. She accepted the robe, slipping into its embrace with reverent slowness. The fabric clung to her body like memory, like something returned rather than received. When she stepped into the light of the corridor, every head turned. The attendants froze, eyes wide, as if they had seen a ghost. One younger girl, who had never dared meet Soraya's eyes before, dropped her tray. The crash of metal echoed down the tiled hall. Soraya did not speak. She did not have to. By the time she entered the southern salon, the tension had thickened. She was expected to join the women of the court in quiet embroidery and tea, a display of refined obedience. But as she passed through the carved archway into the salon, conversations ceased entirely. The women sat in their usual circle, draped in colors of burgundy, plum, and emerald. Yet when they saw her, seated themselves straighter, adjusted their scarves, and one or two cast nervous glances toward the far end of the room. There, standing by the fireplace, was Prince Simal. He was not expected at this hour, and certainly not in the women's wing, but there he was, one hand behind his back, the other holding a rolled letter, his gaze fixed on a point far from anyone's eyes, until she entered. Their gazes met, and something changed. In his eyes, Soraya saw recognition, but not of her, of someone else, of someone already known. The room tensed around them like a bow drawn too tight. He took one step forward. She did not move. Then another. His brow furrowed, his breath grew uneven. His voice, when it came, was low, and trembled not with affection, but with fury. "Where did you get that robe?" The room inhaled. "It was sent to me from the wardrobe," she answered, her voice even. "Who told you to wear it?" "No one." He crossed the space between them in 4 strides, stopping a mere breath away from her. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed, his voice cracking. Then, in a sudden motion, he turned and struck the side table beside him with such force that the teacups upon it shattered, porcelain shards scattering across the marble like petals torn by wind. The women gasped. One fled the room, but Soraya remained. He looked at her then, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the torment of a man who had seen a ghost in the flesh and could not endure it. "You look just like her," he whispered, "exactly like her." She stood frozen, not from fear, but from understanding. Selin had worn this robe, and now so had she, not by design, not to provoke, but by chance, or perhaps by the will of something older than fate. He turned and left without another word. The door slammed behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. The women did not return to their stitching. Their gazes fell to their laps, to the floor, to anywhere but Soraya's face. She left the salon slowly, her footsteps trailing behind her like echoes. The robe, once beautiful, now felt like borrowed skin. Back in her chamber, she tore it from her shoulders and flung it across the divan. Her heart beat with fury, with humiliation, with something far more dangerous: clarity. She was not herself in this palace. She was someone else's ghost. Night descended with indifference. The palace lanterns were lit, the world carried on. But in Soraya's chest, a storm brewed. She did not dine. She did not speak. She sat by the lattice window, her hands folded over her knees, listening to the wind trace the walls like fingers brushing over stone. When the knock came, it was past midnight, not hurried, not hesitant. 3 firm raps. She rose and opened the door herself. Prince Cemal stood in the threshold, his expression unreadable. He wore no sash, no medals, only a simple dark robe belted at the waist. His hair was loose at the temples. He looked like a man stripped of power, stripped of title. "I came to speak," he said. She stepped aside. He did not sit. She did not invite him to. "I lost my temper today," he began. "You did," she replied. He nodded once, accepting the wound. "I did not know that robe was still kept," he said, voice quiet. "It belonged to my first wife. She wore it the last time she appeared in court, the last time she was seen." Soraya's breath caught, but she did not speak. "I thought I had buried that memory, or at least contained it. But seeing you," he swallowed. "You're not her, I know that. But the mirror, I never intended to resemble her," she said. "I know." A pause. The candle between them flickered, casting twin shadows along the walls. The tension in the room was not rage now. It was grief, contained, heavy and aching to be named. "I looked at you," he said, "and for a moment I saw her, but I see you now." He took a step forward. She held her ground. "You are Soraya," he said clearly, for the first time with no mistake, no hesitation, no other name in his breath. "And I ask your forgiveness." Her lips parted, but no words came. He did not touch her. He did not bow. He simply stood there, a man with too many ghosts, and offered her what no one else had: recognition. And then he turned and left. The door closed gently this time. Soraya stood in the silence, her heart thunderous, her eyes shimmering not with tears, but with the fragile bloom of something not yet named, not quite forgiveness, not quite hope, but a beginning, at last. The wind arrived early that morning, slipping through the palace corridors like a thief in prayer. It carried the scent of olives crushed beneath wheels, jasmine heavy from the garden walls, and something else, metallic, faint, like the memory of danger. Soraya woke before the first call to prayer. Her dreams had been restless, filled with footsteps that never revealed their owner, and eyes that watched but never blinked. She had hoped the day would arrive with quiet clarity. Instead, it began with a folded piece of parchment, slipped beneath her chamber door. The paper was rough, no seal, no signature, only a sentence written in sharp, slanted ink. "Dig too deep and you'll share her grave." Her breath stopped. A chill coursed through her spine like a thread drawn with ice. She read it again, but the words did not change. They waited, patient and cruel. She burned the note in the small brazier beside her dressing table, watching the flames consume it inch by inch until nothing remained but ash and the faint echo of a threat. When Nigar Khalfa arrived to prepare her for the day, Soraya did not speak of the note. The older woman would notice eventually. Nigar noticed everything, but for now, Soraya needed time to think. Or perhaps she needed to breathe without the weight of someone else's fear added to her own. The day passed slowly, like a procession of shadows beneath a veiled sun. Conversations were hushed, attendants more nervous than usual, and in the air, the unspoken hum of something not yet named. That evening, a banquet was held in honor of the imperial engineers returning from Anatolia. It was not a grand affair, but the council would be present, and the wives of key advisors had been invited to lend beauty to the proceedings. Soraya was among them. She wore a gown of soft violet, edged in silver, modest and elegant. Her hair had been pulled back into a low braid, a single pin of mother-of-pearl tucked near her temple. She did not look like a threat, but she knew better now. The divan hall had been dressed in its usual formality: polished floors, high arches bathed in candlelight, and tables adorned with glass pitchers, silver bowls, and roses carved from ice. Music played in the distance, not loud enough to interrupt speech, just present enough to mask whispers. She was seated near the center, between the wife of a provincial governor and a quiet, elderly court scribe. Across from her sat Pasha Mahmud, regal in emerald silk, the golden embroidery at his collar glinting like coins in firelight. He greeted her with a smile, measured, polite, nearly bored, but his eyes, pale and unblinking, did not smile. "Lady Soraya," he said, lifting his goblet slightly. "You grace our table again. The court grows lovelier with your presence." "Then the court must have needed beauty," she replied, her voice calm, soft enough to be a compliment, sharp enough to draw blood. He chuckled. "Indeed, and it needs far more than that." The food was served in courses, each more lavish than the last. Spiced lamb, honeyed apricots, saffron rice with almonds. Soraya ate little. Her appetite had disappeared along with her sense of ease. A servant brought her wine, rose-colored, clear, glistening in its cup. She reached for it without thinking, but before the goblet could touch her lips, a hand shot forward and gripped her wrist. Firm, steady, Nigar Khalfa. She appeared beside Soraya like a vision conjured from smoke, her eyes dark and unblinking. "I believe, Hanum," she said aloud, "that this is not your cup." The words held no panic, no urgency, only certainty. The table quieted. Nigar lifted the goblet herself and sniffed it once, then placed it gently on the tablecloth, far from Soraya's reach. Her expression never changed, but the message was received. Something was wrong. The servant who had brought the wine had vanished. No name, no face. Only a silver tray left behind as evidence of presence. Pasha Mahmud raised one brow. "A mistake?" he asked, as though amused. Nigar offered no reply, only bowed her head. "I must ask the pardon of this company," she said, turning to Soraya. "Hanum, your chamber awaits." Soraya nodded once, her throat dry. No one stopped her as she rose. No one dared. Back in her chamber, Nigar remained silent until the doors were closed, the curtains drawn, and the lamps lit low. Then she turned to Soraya and said what Soraya already knew. "They tried to silence you." "I didn't drink it," Soraya whispered. "You weren't meant to. Not yet. But they wanted to remind you that you could." She sank onto the divan, the silk of her gown rustling like water over stone. "I received a note this morning." "I know," Nigar said. "It was read before it reached you. We chose to let it pass. We needed to see how far they would go." Soraya looked up, startled. "We?" Nigar walked slowly to a cabinet, unlocked it, and drew out a small bundle wrapped in linen. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she set it down in Soraya's lap. "She left this with me," Nigar said. 8 years ago. She said, "Someone will come. Not soon, maybe never, but if they do, someone who listens, give them this." Soraya unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a brooch, delicate silver, shaped like a crescent moon cradling a tiny star. The craftsmanship was intricate, unmistakably fine. The kind of jewel not worn for display, but held for memory. She wore it beneath her robes, Nigar said. Hidden, always. She never explained why, but she guarded it like a secret. Soraya's fingers closed around it. The metal was cold, but her palm grew warm with it pressed there. This belonged to Selim. Yes. The silence between them thickened. "I don't know what I've stepped into," Soraya whispered. "But it's not just marriage." "No," Nigar said. "It never was." The wind outside howled louder now, battering against the palace walls as if trying to break through. Soraya looked to the window, then back to the brooch in her hand. "There is something in this palace," she said, more to herself than to Nigar. "Something that wants to stay buried. And something," Nigar added, "that refuses to die." The candlelight flickered. And in the hush of that moment, Soraya understood that her place in Topkapi was no longer defined by her veil, her silence, or even her name. She had become a listener of ghosts, and ghosts, once heard, demand to be answered. The moon hung low that night, caught in a veil of clouds, casting its pale light like a ghostly lantern over the garden paths of Topkapi. The palace had retreated into silence, its great domes dark, its corridors still. Only the cypresses stirred, whispering secrets to one another in the hush of midnight. Their shadows danced along the stone walls, slender and swaying, like women cloaked in mourning. Soraya walked alone. She had told no one. She needed no escort. Her heart had grown too full, her thoughts too loud for the confines of her chamber. The garden offered the only space wide enough to contain what now lived inside her. The brooch still lay wrapped in cloth, hidden in her sash. Its weight was not physical, yet it pressed against her ribs with each step. The path curved gently beneath her feet, lined with gravel and edged in neat rows of hyacinths and narcissus. The scent lingered in the damp air, sweet and thick, mingling with the distant perfume of jasmine. Somewhere in the distance a fountain trickled softly, its rhythm steady and soothing, like breath in prayer. She paused beneath a tall cypress, whose trunk was warped with age. The bark was rough beneath her fingertips as she reached out, steadying herself, and then she heard him. "I was told you might come here tonight." His voice, low, solemn, shaped by shadows. Soraya turned. Prince Jamal stood a few paces away, his figure half obscured by the trees, his cloak draped over his shoulders like a mantle of ink. His face, dimly lit by the moon, held no mask this time, no distance, only weariness and truth. She did not answer. She simply watched. He took a slow step forward, then another, stopping a respectful distance from her. His hands were clasped behind him, but the tension in his posture betrayed restraint, not from her, but from himself. "I once believed silence protected," he said softly. "Now I see it only buries the living beside the dead." She remained quiet. He inhaled deeply, as if what he was about to say had been sealed inside him for far too long. She found the letters in his chamber. Selin. Letters from beyond the border. From rebels, gold promises signed in invisible ink, names she wasn't supposed to see. Mine among them. Soraya's breath caught, not in shock, but in the realization that this was the truth behind every locked door, every averted gaze. "She came to me the night before the banquet," he continued. "She held the parchment in her hand. I remember. Her fingers were shaking, not from fear, but from fury." His voice broke slightly. "She said, 'If I speak, they'll silence me. If I don't, they'll use your name.'" He looked away toward the stone wall beyond the garden, as if seeing something only he could recall. "I told her to wait, to let me confront him, to let me protect her. But she wouldn't be still. She said silence was the luxury of cowards." A long pause. "She vanished the next day." Soraya closed her eyes, her chest tightening. "I searched," he said, his voice hollow now. "I questioned servants, guards, councilmen, but the orders had already spread. The story had been written before she disappeared. She fell ill, they said. She was unstable." He turned his face back toward Soraya, and the grief in his gaze was unfiltered. "I remained silent. I told myself it was to gather proof, to protect her memory. But the truth is," he hesitated, then spoke as if the words burned on his tongue. "I was afraid of what it would cost to speak her name, of what it would reveal about myself." She took a step closer, not out of pity, not out of need, but out of understanding. "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me?" "Because you are the first who has listened without asking anything for yourself," he said. "You do not press, you do not pry, you observe and you endure, just as she did. But you are not her, and I will not let you become her shadow." Soraya's voice was quiet, but steady. "You still speak of her, as if she owns your heart." He did not deny it. "She owns my silence," he said, "but you awaken my voice." The night around them pressed inward, soft and thick. A distant owl called once, then was gone. The garden felt suspended in time, a sanctuary untouched by the palace beyond its walls. Soraya stepped forward again, until only the thinnest breath separated them. "I don't need you to choose between us," she said. "The dead ask nothing of the living, but I will not wear the veil of another woman, not even in your memory." Jamal's eyes closed briefly, as if in pain, and then opened again. "I know." She reached into her sash and withdrew the brooch. Its silver crescent caught the moonlight with a soft glow. She left this with Nigar, she said, for someone who would listen. He looked at it with reverence, then met her eyes. You listened, he said. I did, she answered. But now it is time for you to speak. A long silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was honest. Then Soraya lifted the brooch and placed it in his hand. Speak, she whispered. Speak for her. Speak for yourself. And if you cannot yet speak for you, speak for both of us. He looked down at the brooch in his palm, the moonlight trembling over the edges, and for the first time since she had known him, Prince Shamal's eyes glistened, not from rage, not from shame, but from the unbearable weight of a truth, finally freed. I will, he said. And in that promise, spoken not to a wife nor to a consort, but to a woman who had stood before him not as a reflection of the past, but as the keeper of his future, something shifted. It was not yet love, but it was trust. And in the halls of power, where poison moved more swiftly than devotion, trust was a flame no one could extinguish. The palace awoke that morning to an unnatural stillness, not the quiet of reverence, nor the soft hush that followed a snowfall. No, this silence bore teeth. It moved through the corridors like an invisible fog, pressing against the servants' shoulders, slipping under the harem doors, and clinging to the robes of the councilmen like the scent of betrayal. Soraya felt it before she heard it, a change in the rhythm of the palace. Doors that had always opened to her did not today. Eyes that had once observed her with suspicion now averted themselves entirely. Whispers cut short when she entered a room. Heads lowered not out of respect, but to avoid association. Something had shifted. By the time Nigar Khalfa arrived at her chamber, the silence had sharpened into a blade. You must dress, Nigar said. Her voice was flat, too even, controlled. For what? Soraya asked, already knowing. The Imperial Council has summoned you. She turned toward the mirror. Her reflection was calm, composed. Her pulse, however, betrayed her. It fluttered like a bird beneath glass. She wore a robe of slate grey. No jewelry. Her hair was braided simply, pinned close to her head. She looked neither noble nor rebellious, only resolute. When the guards came to escort her, she did not flinch. She did not ask questions. They did not offer answers. The divan hall was colder than she remembered. The windows had been opened, but no breeze stirred. Light spilled in through the tall arches, illuminating the faces of the gathered councilmen like candles set before masks. At the center, elevated as always, sat the Sultan's empty chair, its absence speaking louder than any decree. And to the left of it, draped in emerald and adorned with self-righteous calm, stood Pasha Mahmud. His smile, as Soraya entered, was not cruel. It was confident, as if the pieces had long been set on the board, and now he had only to claim his victory. She has been passing messages to foreign hands, he said, his voice resonant and practiced. Letters have been intercepted, coded of course, but the intention clear. He held out several scrolls, their edges charred for effect. The ink was fresh, the script forged, but the seal bore her family's crest. A woman from the provinces, with no true lineage, suddenly elevated, suddenly inquisitive, suddenly dangerous. He let the words settle like dust. Soraya did not speak. He turned to the others. We have tolerated her long enough. She walks the halls as if she belongs to us. But perhaps she belongs to another. Murmurs rippled through the room, and then, from the edge of the chamber, a guard stepped forward. She has been seen in forbidden quarters, whispering with servants, disobeying the hierarchy of the harem. Another joined him. A letter was found beneath her mattress, not written in her hand, but hidden with intent. It was a performance, polished, cruel. Soraya remained still, but inside her chest, fire began to rise. The Grand Vizier spoke next, his voice slow and grave. Until this can be investigated fully, the lady shall be confined to the East Tower. Her fate was being sealed with silk-gloved hands, But then, before the guard could take a single step toward her, another voice broke the air. "No!" The sound was not shouted. It was not loud, but it carried through the chamber with the clarity of thunder before a storm. Prince Jamal stood in the arched doorway, his presence immediate and undeniable. He walked with calm, but not with courtesy. His eyes did not ask permission. They claimed space. He wore no ceremonial cloak, no medals, only a dark coat, and in his hands a leather-bound book and a brooch wrapped in linen. He walked to the center of the hall and stood before the council, not beside it. The symbolism was clear. "I have been silent," he began, "too long, and silence, I now know, is a kind of betrayal." Mahmud shifted in his seat, his calm flickering. "This woman," Jamal continued, nodding to Soraya, "is not a traitor. She is a listener, and because she listened, the truth now stands before you." He unwrapped the brooch and held it up. "Selin Hatun's, given to her by my mother, kept hidden until now." He opened the book next, its pages worn, one marked by a dried rose and a faded stain of blood. This was her journal, kept in secret, filled with names, meetings, letters she feared would never reach the right hands. She trusted only one woman. He turned, and from the far end of the hall, Nigar Khalfa stepped forward. No longer a shadow behind the silks of power, she walked with her head high, her gaze fixed, her steps measured like a queen stripped of her crown, but never of her dignity. "I kept Selin's words," she said, her voice unwavering, "for the day the palace would listen." Gasps, confusion, resistance. Mahmud stood suddenly. "You dare!" Jamal silenced him with a look. "You silenced one woman. You will not silence two." The council fell into chaos, murmurs, arguments, denial, but the proof lay before them, and the eyes of the empire's heir did not waver. When the Sultan's voice was finally summoned, sent through a trusted messenger, it bore only one command. Mahmud was to be stripped of all titles, his assets seized, and his name removed from the court registry. Exile, immediate and permanent. The Pasha paled, his face collapsing inward, no longer a mask of power, but of desperation. He said nothing. He was led away like a man who had forgotten how to walk without being followed. The council dispersed in silence. Only Chimal and Soraya remained, and Nigar. The prince turned to her, and this time he bowed, not as a man before a servant, but as a son before the last keeper of truth. "Thank you," he said simply. She placed her hand briefly over her chest. "She waits no longer." And then she turned and left. Chimal walked toward Soraya. He did not touch her, not yet. But the look in his eyes no longer held the weight of loss. It held recognition, and something more dangerous, something stronger than vengeance, something called justice. The dawn crept into the city like a blessing withheld. Over the domes of Topkapi, the sky burned with a bruised hue of copper and indigo. The call to prayer had come and gone, yet the palace stirred with neither routine nor reverence. Its breath was tight, its pulse irregular. Even the eunuchs who lit the hallway lanterns moved with eyes lowered, as though afraid to disturb the tension woven into the marble walls. Inside her chamber, Soraya stood at the edge of the window, her back straight, her gaze distant. She had not slept. Her robe was of ivory, unadorned except for the faintest embroidery at the hem, a flowering vine that wrapped around her ankles like a quiet defiance. Her hair had been plaited tightly and coiled into a crown at the back of her head by Nigar's own hands. No pins of silver, no jewels of pearl, only presence, only truth. The summons had arrived before the sun had risen fully. The Sultan requests the presence of Prince Jamal Effendi and Lady Soraya Hanum before the full Imperial Council. The matter is urgent. Nigar said nothing as she fastened Soraya's sash. Her fingers were steady, but her silence was heavy with meaning. She knew what this day was, what it would cost, what it could heal. When Soraya stepped into the hall, she did not feel fear. She felt the weight of everything that had been carried in silence. Selin's truth, her own, Simal's, and the bloodless war that had been fought with whispers and poisoned wine. The divan chamber had never looked more vast. The ceiling arched high above, carved and painted with stars in gold leaf that shimmered in the lamplight like eyes watching from heaven. Velvet drapes, deep emerald and crimson, framed the walls. Incense burned in bronze censers, curling in slow spirals toward the dome. The councilmen sat in rows, their robes pressed, their turbans perfect, their faces unreadable. At the center, beneath the golden emblem of the crescent and star, sat the Sultan, cloaked in black and blue, his gaze sharp behind heavy-lidded eyes. To his right, Pasha Mahmud stood with his usual self-composure, dressed in ceremonial green, his expression carved from marble. He did not look at Soraya as she entered, but his hand tightened around the edge of his robe. And to the left, Prince Cemal. He wore no court cloak, no decorations, only the dark coat of a man who had shed the illusion of immunity. In his hands, he carried Selin's journal and the silver brooch, the two quiet instruments of a rebellion born not in violence, but in memory. He did not glance at Soraya, but when she stepped to stand beside him, their proximity said everything. The Sultan spoke. "We are gathered to judge not only treason, but the weight of truth long denied. What is presented before us must be complete. Deceptions will be punished, but so will silence." He turned his eyes to Cemal. "Speak." Cemal bowed, not to the Sultan alone, but to the truth. "For 8 years, I have lived with the burden of a disappearance. Selin Hatun, my wife, was said to have died from illness. That was a lie." Gasps murmured through the chamber. One councilman dropped the ivory handle of his fan. Cemal raised the journal. She did not die. She vanished. But before she did, she uncovered proof of financial dealings between this council and separatist cells across the eastern border. He turned to Mahmud now. Direct, steady. "She brought that proof to me. I failed her. I told her to wait, and when she would not, she disappeared. Her name was erased, her rooms cleared, her letters destroyed." He opened the journal. The pages crackled softly, like dry leaves underfoot. But this survived, hidden, protected, in the hands of a woman who guarded it, knowing one day it might be needed. Nigar Khalfa stepped forward, her gait firm, her presence impossible to ignore. She bowed to the Sultan, then spoke clearly. "I was ordered to burn her belongings. I burned what they gave me, not what she left behind." The chamber held its breath. "I kept her journal. I kept her brooch. I kept her voice." The Sultan nodded once. "Show us." Cemal offered the journal. A guard delivered it to the vizier, who opened it beneath the court's scrutiny. The blood-stained page was marked. The rose pressed within still bore its color, muted by time. Gasps rose again. A name was written at the edge of the page. Mahmud. The Pasha paled. "These are forged," he said sharply. "Convenient stories. Symbols meant to manipulate." But his voice was brittle. The Sultan turned to him. "And the letters found beneath Lady Soraya's bed?" "Also forged," Cemal said, his voice a blade. "By your order, I retrieved the seal myself from your private scribe. He is prepared to confess." Mahmud stepped forward, his robes swaying like a serpent uncoiled. "This is treason. You accuse a member of the Imperial Council before the Sultan himself. I accuse a man who killed a woman in silence and now seeks to bury another." Cemal's voice did not rise, but it carried. The Sultan raised a hand. Silence fell. His eyes moved from Cemal to Nigar, then to Mahmud, and finally to Soraya. She met his gaze without faltering. "Lady Soraya," he said, "have you anything to say?" She took a breath, then a step forward. Her voice, when it came, was soft but piercing. "I was brought to this palace with no voice of my own. I wore robes chosen by others, walked paths laid by ghosts. I did not seek power. I sought only truth." She turned slightly, eyes sweeping the chamber. "I was called by another woman's name. But I listened, and because I listened, I heard what others tried to silence. She looked to the Sultan. I have no legacy but what truth grants me. A hush as thick as smoke settled over the council. The Sultan spoke at last. Pasha Mahmud, you are hereby stripped of your title, your lands, your gold, and your seat on the Imperial Council. Your name is to be struck from the registry of the court. You will depart this city within the hour and shall never return. Mahmud staggered as if struck. The guards moved swiftly. He did not resist. He knew the end when it arrived. When the doors closed behind him, the chamber seemed to breathe for the first time in hours. The Sultan stood. Let it be known, silence is not loyalty. And truth, though buried, grows like a vine. He stepped down from his dais and left the room. The council dispersed. Only 3 remained. Cemal turned to Soraya. He did not speak immediately. He walked toward her, his steps quiet, his hands empty. And then, before the remnants of the council, before the women behind the lattice, before the ghosts in the walls, he knelt, not as a prince, not as a husband, as a man. You gave me back my voice, he said, his gaze lifting to hers. And I vow to never speak another woman's name before yours again. Soraya did not answer. She reached forward and placed her hand lightly against his shoulder, not in forgiveness, not in command, but in acknowledgement. The silence between them was no longer a burden. It was a bond, and in that moment, beneath the gaze of a kingdom, the sword of power bowed before the rose of truth. Spring arrived in Istanbul not with fanfare, but with a sigh. The mists of winter had retreated to the corners of memory, and now the palace stirred with a gentler breath. Dew shimmered over the stone pathways like fallen stars. The hyacinths, once bowed beneath the weight of cold silence, now stood proud in pale violet rows along the garden walls. Cypress trees no longer mourned, they whispered lullabies to the breeze. Topkapi no longer felt like a cage carved from marble. It felt like something had been exhaled, like grief had loosened its grip. Soraya walked through the southern garden in the hush of early morning, her steps slow, deliberate, sacred. The hem of her rose-colored ferrus skimmed the tiled stones like a second breeze. Her dark braid lay gently across her back, tied with a ribbon the color of dawn. She wore no veil. Her face was bared to the sky. She was not hurrying. She was not hiding. There was no longer a need. The palace that had once watched her with suspicion now watched her with reverence. The same attendants who once avoided her gaze now lowered their heads with something softer. Respect, perhaps. Maybe gratitude. But Soraya did not walk for them. She walked because she could. The sun crested over the eastern domes, bathing the courtyard in gold. Light spilled over the garden fountain, its mosaic tiles gleaming blue and green beneath the rippling surface. Roses bloomed at its edge, real ones, newly planted. A few petals drifted across the water like memories freed from weight. Jamal waited beneath the oldest cypress. He wore no sash, no insignia. His tunic was simple, his sleeves rolled just above the wrist, his hands were bare, the posture of a man who ruled nothing in that moment but his own silence. When Soraya approached, he did not move forward. He waited for her to choose the distance. She stopped beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, cool and kind. Jamal turned his head slowly, just enough to meet her eyes. "You chose this path alone," he said, his voice lower than the wind, "but you never walked it without being seen." She held his gaze. "I know that now." He studied her face, not as one searches for a reflection, but as one learns a new name. "Do you feel free?" he asked. "No," she answered softly, "but I feel real." He nodded once, and that was enough. They walked side by side down the curved path, where small shadows of olive branches danced across the ground, like calligraphy written by the sun. They passed a pair of handmaidens who curtsied without a word. An elder gardener paused at a distance, eyes soft, hat in hand. As they reached the garden's edge, Soraya paused beneath the vine-covered pergola. The bench, carved with floral motifs, stood empty. It had once been a place for waiting. Now, it was simply a place. "May I leave you here?" Jamal asked. She nodded. He bowed his head, not low, not ceremonious, just enough to honor the air between them. Then he turned and walked away. She did not watch him go. She listened to his footsteps until they faded. Then she sat on the bench, hands resting in her lap. The silence was gentle, like hands cupped around a flame. Later, when the sun had risen fully, and the palace hummed once more with its daily rhythm, Soraya returned to her chamber. It was no longer cold, no longer a room borrowed from ghosts. It smelled of lavender and lemon blossom. A fresh pitcher of water rested on the carved table beside the window. The curtains danced lightly in the breeze. She walked to her writing desk, opened a drawer, and retrieved a small lacquered box. Within it lay the brooch, Selin's brooch. Its silver crescent still cradled the tiny star. No tarnish, no dust, only silence held gently in metal. Soraya reached for the porcelain vase nearby. Inside it, a single rose. Fresh, soft pink. Its petals trembled as she placed the brooch beside it, their edges just touching. She did not speak. But in that gesture, two stories met. Two women who had walked the same corridors. One vanished, one remained. And both, at last, had been heard. She stood for a long time before the window, watching the garden below. From this height, the pathways appeared like threads of silk, weaving in and out, leading nowhere and everywhere. She could see the fountain's surface gleam. She could hear the faint laughter of two younger girls playing beneath the trees. For the first time, she smiled. Not politely, not cautiously, but fully. She turned back to the room, and her own reflection caught her in the mirror. Not veiled, not dressed in blue, not watching herself as someone else might. Just Soraya. And that was enough. She walked to the door, and as she stepped into the corridor, into the future, into herself, the world did not tremble. It listened. And then it remembered. They had called her by another woman's name, until history had no choice but to remember her own. The palace had changed, not in its walls or its towers, which still rose proudly over the Bosphorus with domes of gold and stone, kissed by light. The marble remained cool beneath the hands of time. The gates still opened at dawn with ceremonial precision. But the air had softened, and so had the silences. Topkapi was no longer haunted. At the edge of the southern garden, where the roses bloomed earliest and the cypress trees stood like guardians of memory, a young girl ran barefoot across the tiled path, her laughter breaking like bells in the air. Her hair was thick and dark, pulled into a braid that unraveled as she moved. She carried a wooden horse in one hand and a silken scarf in the other, pretending they were flags of faraway kingdoms. She was 6, but the garden bent to her as if she were sovereign. Behind her, walking slowly beneath the pergola, was a woman dressed in cream and dusty rose, her figure elegant, her posture regal, her face touched by time, but not weariness. Her eyes, still the color of dark amber, followed the child with a tenderness sharpened by experience. Soraya Hanum, or as they now called her in quiet reverence, the woman who changed the court without ever raising her voice. She had not sought the title, nor the power, but both had come, shaped by love, forged by truth, and made enduring by the choices that followed. "Layla," Soraya called gently. The girl turned. "Do not run so far. Your father's meeting is nearly finished. He will come find you. Will he bring sweets?" The girl grinned, her teeth small and bright. "Only if he's won the debate. Then I hope the other men lose." Soraya laughed softly. 8 years had passed since she walked that garden as a stranger cloaked in another woman's shadow. Now she walked it as a wife, a mother, and more quietly than any court scribe could put into words, as a witness to change. The palace had not become a paradise, but it had become a place where voices once silenced now echoed. Women no longer disappeared. Letters no longer vanished. Nigar Khalfa had lived to see 3 reforms pass through the harem. Education for every girl under its roof, freedom to write without permission, and the right to refuse a robe not chosen by one's own hand. She retired 2 years earlier, her hair fully silver, her eyes still sharp. She had chosen to leave, and that, Soraya believed, was its own kind of victory. Cemal had aged with quiet resolve. The boyish smoothness of his face had been replaced by the creases of responsibility, but his gaze had only grown more certain. He still walked the palace corridors with measured steps, still ruled with temperance and insight. But when he returned to the garden each evening, he left his titles at the threshold. He returned as a man who had chosen a woman, not for her silence, nor for her lineage, but for her unwavering truth. Their marriage had not been without hardship. There had been years where trust had to be relearned, where grief over Selin's fate returned in waves uninvited, where politics had clawed at their peace, but love, real love, love earned, not granted, had weathered it all. They had 2 children, Layla, spirited and bold, who bore her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn mouth, and Aidin, just 3, quiet and observant, who often followed his sister like a shadow and clutched a tiny carved bird Soraya had once made from olive wood. Soraya's world was no longer made of whispers. It was filled with voices, children laughing, women debating, scribes composing stories that no longer omitted the names of the women who had lived them. And what of Mahmud? He had died in exile 2 years after the trial, alone. His name was erased from official records, but his story remained, not as a warning, but as a wound remembered. His downfall had opened the path for new advisors, younger voices, honest ones, men who spoke less and listened more. Cemal had chosen them carefully with Soraya's counsel, though he never admitted it before the council. Only in the quiet of their chambers did he call her his greatest strategist. As the breeze stirred the garden once more, Soraya rose from the bench and walked toward the alcove where the jasmine bloomed thickest. There, beneath a carved arch, stood a low marble pedestal. Upon it sat a small box, sealed in glass. Inside, a single dried rose, and beside it, a silver crescent brooch cradling a tiny star. No plaque, no name, but every servant, every guest, every child who asked learned the story of 2 women, one who was silenced, one who refused to be, and of the day their truths bloomed, one in blood, the other in voice. Soraya reached for her daughter's hand and placed it gently over the glass. This is where we remember. Remember what, Mama? That history is not made by those who shout, she said, brushing Layla's cheek with the back of her hand, but by those who remain. Layla smiled. Then I will always remain. Soraya kissed her forehead. Cemal's voice called gently from the distance. Soraya, the sun is setting. She turned, and as she walked toward him, the light behind her caught her figure in gold. The woman they once called by another's name now stood not as a shadow, but as the one they would never forget. Some stories end with silence, others with a name finally spoken aloud. And then there are stories like this one, of Soraya, of Selin, of a rose that dared to bloom where it was never meant to grow. Stories that whisper of courage not shouted from balconies, but carried in quiet defiance, in the gaze that doesn't lower, in the truth held tightly against the tide of power. This tale is not just about palaces and betrayal, nor simply about love found and reclaimed. It is a story of becoming, of stepping out from someone else's shadow and daring to say, "This is who I am, and I will not be erased." Let it remind us all, especially those who have ever been misunderstood, misnamed, or silenced, that our truth, when protected with dignity and patience, will always find its voice. If this story moved you, made you feel seen, or kept your heart holding its breath, let us know in the comments. What part left a mark on you? What lesson will you carry? And if you made it all the way to the end, Write the word rose in the comments below. It's our secret symbol. A quiet sign that you too remained. If you'd like to support the amazing team that brings these stories to life, we would be deeply honored by your super thanks, in any amount your heart feels right. Every gesture, big or small, helps us continue crafting these emotional journeys. And if you cannot support us that way, know this: sharing this story with someone who needs to hear it is just as powerful. A sister, a friend, a daughter, someone who may be waiting to find her name again. We've left other unforgettable stories for you in the cards. Stories of resilience, of forbidden love, of women who rewrite their destinies. Thank you for listening with your heart. We'll meet again, wherever truth dares to bloom.